dramatized adaptation inspired by historical cases of identity reinvention and hidden estates. Names, dates, and some scenes have been fictionalized for narrative purposes. This account honors the investigative pattern and archival methods of similar historical cases while recasting the central figures as the Holloway family in 1937. The hotel corridor smelled of boiled coffee and worn carpet. Late afternoon light, thin and gray as old linen, slipped beneath a heavy door and pooled across a parlor that had not seen a visitor in years. A maid's hand closed on the knob and found resistance. Stiff, sticky, as if the lock had been waiting a long time to be opened. The key rattled once, then turned, and the door came loose with the soft, sickening sound of a life exhaled. On the couch, a woman lay curled like a shawl left on a chair. Her hair had thinned to a few stubborn wisps. Her face was mapped by folds of skin that had once smiled into mirrors of polished glass and gilt. She had been small in death, smaller than the portrait that used to hang in ballroom foyers. Someone had placed a faded satin fan near her hand, a last theatrical gesture. On the carpet, next to a trunk with an old brass lock, the maid found a movement, an edge of fabric that, when pulled, revealed thickets of folded paper pressed tight like the pages of a secret ledger. They called for the manager, for someone who could summon a doctor. The doctor, a man with a tremor in his fingers that never showed in his ledger entries, pushed aside the shawl and probed the chest. He smelled old tobacco and the dry metallic tang of papers that had never seen sunlight. Beneath the bodice, when the nightgown rose with his indecent attention, another hand, this one more reluctant, found the bulge of bills sewn into the seam. Later, by the time a clerk from the law firm arrived and began a rough inventory with a pocket ledger, the room looked less like a parlor and more like an archive of a single life. Trunks cracked at the corners, hat boxes stacked like small tombs, newspapers brittle and yellow heaped against the radiator, a silver toothpick case, brooches in velvet bowls, a tangle of rings that had not been polished for decades, and then a leather valise, wide and lined in faded silk, its lining slashed to hide stacks of currency, notes folded and banded with fraying rubber, gold certificates, bearer bonds stamped with old corporate seals, slips of paper that, when read, answered questions no one outside the room had yet dared to ask. She had been sleeping on $500,000, one journalist would later write in a column meant to stir readers to outrage or wonder, often both. That sentence traveled faster than the suits who arrived to catalogue the estate. It worked as a hook, the familiar paradox of a life lived in public poverty while private coffers overflow, a single, stubborn contradiction in the bone of the Depression. But the money, the newsprint, and the brooches were only the beginning. The real mystery lay in the name the woman used and the name that lay folded neatly inside a small prayer book. Evelyn Holloway. The photograph in the gilt frame, one of those fashionable studio portraits with painted clouds behind the subject, showed a young woman with a high, deliberate smile, a string of pearls, and a posture learned in parlors that never felt like home. She seemed to have been born to that smile. The records, when they were eventually chased down, told a different story. If this story reaches you and makes the hair on your neck rise, subscribe for more investigative history. There are other forgotten estates and other half-truths waiting in the margins of the archive. She had not always been Evelyn. In the beginning she was named for a town's river and the soot that settled on her mother's apron. She came from a place where the mills groaned and the air tasted of carded wool. There, in a grey mill town whose name the Holloway parlor guests never learned, her parents shared a room above a bakery and a single bed with a younger sister who laughed loud enough to drown the clap of machines. Their immigrant accent clung to them like a second coat. They had arrived in this country with hands raw from packing and an almost holy belief that a new name could be as binding as a vow. As a child, she watched the wealthy like one watches a stage, their gestures, the rhythm of their conversation, the tiny gestures that signaled membership. She learned to hold her chin at a certain angle when praised. She learned what to do with her hands when seated at a tea, how to lift the saucer, how to make the small talk that made invisible gates feel open. She polished manners the way other girls polished shoes. At 14, she was taken into service for a family who summered on the coast and wintered in townhouses with gaslight staircases. Domestic service was a teacher of social theatre. There were instructive cruelties. The daughter of the house, bored and cruel in equal measure, would press lipstick to the apprentice's cheek to mark a joke that tasted like humiliation. But the pay was steadier than the mill, and there was something else, momentary, furtive, intoxicating, that those parlors offered: access. Between the laying of china and the drawing of curtains, the servant found a new vocabulary of self, one she could try on in private and discard when the days became too cold. She began to construct a history she wished to inhabit. She told the parlors she came from a genteel southern family lost to destitution. She adjusted her accent carefully, absorbing 2 or 3 syllables at a time until the rough edges smoothed. She learned the art of evasion, never as a liar, she would later say, in a letter never intended for posterity, but as a sculptor of circumstance. Her sister, whom she renamed when the story required it, became the daughter she presented at teas and charity balls. In public, their relationship simplified. An elderly aunt watched the pair and nodded approvingly. To the city, the Holloways were a small, respectable household, with a tragic line of lost fortune, and importantly, a pedigree that opened the right doors. It was in those doors that she met the man who would change everything. He was a publisher and a politician in the loose, mercurial way men were, both when they paddled in money and power. His name was Charles Wortham in the papers, ornate and suited to a man who signed letters in looped pen strokes and kept a private box at the opera, but those who courted him knew him for his appetite for risk. Gambling sat at the center of his life like a hearth. There were nights in clubrooms where conversation dispersed into cigar smoke and bets were made in low voices that did not survive daylight. Their intimacy was strategic. It was not the raw, romantic arrangement of an old novel, no quick marriage under a willow. Instead, it was a bargain negotiated in chairs upholstered in faded velvet, sex and theater in exchange for access to accounts, to names, to the weight of a signature. He lent her the social capital she lacked and, in turn, used her as both companion and talisman. Invitations multiplied. She began to be seen in a different light. At luncheons with women who kept portfolios of sons to marry, at charity bazaars whose proceeds never seemed to touch the families in the breadlines. It suited both of them. For him, she was a kind of domestic myth, a performance of legitimacy. For her, he was a lever. He taught her the language of estates, of trusts and bonds, terms that had previously meant little beyond the small, solid coins her mother kept in a biscuit tin. He advised, or perhaps allowed, the opening of accounts in names that could be trusted to disappear into the safe spaces of corporate privacy. There were bearer bonds, by then an instrument of convenience and secrecy. There were gold certificates that glowed like relics under lamplight. She learned how to keep paper moving away from prying accountants and capricious banks. At times, there were glimmers of tenderness that complicated the ledger of their transactions. He would bring her to dinners, where men in embroidered waistcoats toasted futures and popped corks. When the room thinned, they would stand near an open door and talk of the flush of youth and the burden of mortality, as if those were the concerns of all human beings. These moments did not redeem the bargain. They only made it human. The ledger lines once made had a habit of becoming a life. What she wanted more than any single object was belonging. In the parlor where she had once served, she had learned to imagine herself on the other side of the threshold, seated at a tea with the measured voice, the right address, the certainty that a name could make a person invisible to certain cruelties. Wealth promised that invisibility. The cost, as she learned, was a history. To shield that history, she adopted layers of fiction. Sisters became daughters. A childhood of thrift and coal dust became a southern upbringing among small plantations and broken names. The stories were simple and efficient, an origin as manufactured as a hat in a millinery. Even as she accepted gifts and a share in investments, she kept something secret and apart, currency untouched by ledgers, a private cache of wealth that would not be subject to bank audits or political scandal. She had watched banks during the earlier half of the decade, during the first waves of the Depression, and had absorbed two lessons. Institutions could fail, and paper records could be opened. Cash, she decided, was a palimpsest only she could read. The method of concealment was both cunning and unsentimental. Currency was sewn into garments, hems of coats, the linings of hats, the seams of underthings. It was folded into the false bottoms of trunks, placed within hollowed-out candlesticks and buried in the pockets of books whose spines had been salted with glue. Gold certificates, the kind that still carried the sheen of a pre-war day, were wrapped in oilcloth and slipped under mattress boards. Bearer bonds, anonymous as the wind, were packed into valises and sent under assumed names across state lines. She learned the economy of secrecy the way other women learned to economize a recipe, one careful measurement at a time. Their arrangement also included a domestic fiction that had to be maintained. The sister she had once danced with on the threshing room floor became an invented child, presented as a girl whose health had been delicate, whose schooling was managed by governesses in the city. When members of society glanced in their direction, they saw a matriarch protecting a fragile charge. That public lie functioned like a veil. It granted the pair sympathetic looks at luncheons, it excused eccentric habits, and it explained the reluctance to marry that rumors might otherwise short-circuit. Cities are full of paradoxes, and the 1930s condensed some of them into tight, painful outlines. While breadlines grew and people queued for work, there were parlors where women arranged roses in crystal bowls, and gentlemen still insisted that a credit could be rebuilt with a determined signature. Evelyn Holloway, by then well rehearsed in the art of appearing, moved between these worlds with a skill that bordered on vertigo. She held both a silver watch and the memory of a coal stove. Her story, though, never escaped the peculiar loneliness of someone who had traded roots for veneers. As the wider economy shuddered through cycles of fear and uncertain recovery, she began to make choices that would eventually harden into an eccentric seclusion. The winter of 1936 into 1937 brought new shocks. Banks tightened credits. Rumors of runs flared and faded in the papers. For some people, these were abstract dangers. For Evelyn, they were immediate. She had seen overturns happen to other families she knew. Sudden collapses after a signature call, an embezzlement exposed at a luncheon. She feared not the loss of furniture, but the loss of the stage on which her entire lie depended, the trust of those who believed in the Holloway name. Her solution was radical and, in a way, simple. She withdrew. Where others kept accounts to be managed and audited, she moved wealth into things that lived outside institutional sight. She paid in cash. She closed accounts. She insisted that new checks be made in old names. For a while it was a private exercise, an act of prudent discretion. But one decision became a habit, and the habit became a life. She took a suite at the Wellington House, a hotel on a quiet avenue that catered to those who wished to exist without the obligations of a permanent home. Hotels of this sort were museum-like. Staff rotated, bills were passed in envelopes, and long-term residents kept keys like talismans. Rooms were furnished with comforts that felt like memories. A faded chaise, a dressing table with a small drawer for jewelry, a drape that never quite shut out the sound of snow. Evelyn chose a corner suite with windows that faced an internal garden. She liked the modest privacy and the way the hotel's muffled world allowed a person to become a room and nothing more. At first, the seclusion was strategic. She came down to breakfast in the dining room to maintain the fiction, but she kept to the edges of conversations. She brought with her a companion, a sister who never quite looked like a daughter and who cultivated a demeanor of weary dignity. They took tea at regular times. Charity organizers came and left with polite requests granted or refused. The staff learned the pattern of orders, the precise angle at which the curtains were to be tied, the way the bedside lamp should be positioned. They learned, too, where to find the keys when the lady chose a new hiding place for a packet of notes. Years accumulated like dust on picture frames. The rooms filled with objects that made sense only to her, boxes of mail she never opened, letters with envelopes unbroken, trunks with false bottoms. Newspapers were piled up against radiators so thick that they looked like small monuments to days that had passed. There was a ritual to how she lived. She would wake before dawn and sit near the window with a metal tray of coins, sorting them into categories, small bills folded, larger notes banded, and then she would sit for a long time listening to a radio program that played both classical music and offers from advertisers promising the restoration of youth. The sound of that, mixed with the tick of a mantel clock, created the soundtrack of the life she built. Isolation has a peculiar architecture. It is not only absence of voices, but the building of internal echoes. Over decades, conversations between the Holloways became small plays they performed for an audience of two. They referenced events that had happened before, the before that had been carefully composed and therefore perfect. They kept up an appearance of small scandal, an occasional referral to a faintly scandalous suitor, or a charity with which they were involved, to make themselves legible to a society that moved on without them. The companion aged alongside Evelyn, and when illness came, it took the companion first. The death of the companion cracked the facade. Staff found the companion in bed one morning, pale and still. There were small practical arrangements, a notice to a distant relative, a caretaker called in to take care of the final details. Only then did the isolation begin to evaporate into procedural light. After the companion's funeral, a modest affair attended by 2 clergy and a hotel maid, someone from the hotel, following regulation and curiosity in equal measure, opened a sealed drawer and found contraband, notes sewn into linen, certificates wrapped in oilcloth, and buried inside a Bible that had been presented as family heirloom, a stack of letters written in a handwriting that shifted between careful calligraphy and tremulous slashes. When the manager called a law office, nobody imagined the complication that would follow. Lawyers are, by temperament, people who enjoy the clarity of lists and receipts. They began a formal inventory, which is to say they began to impose a narrative structure on the chaos of a life. Their ledger recorded items in measured entries: 1 lady's bracelet, 1 set of socks with notes sewn into the hem, 1 valise containing bearer bonds. Each item became a potential clue. One of the lawyers assigned to the case was young and at once both conscientious and hungry for proof. He had the kind of focus that made other lawyers say he would become a perennial presence in courtrooms if he could be bothered with the necessary social lubrications of politics and introduction. He took to the job not like a scavenger but as an archivist, careful, patient, methodical. He photographed each object, flattened each paper with polite gloves, and placed the items in archival boxes that smelled faintly of starch. When he came upon a paper that suggested an origin at odds with the regal air of Evelyn Holloway, an old baptismal slip, a census excerpt noting an immigrant household in a mill town, he did not leap to sensational denunciations. He did what an investigator does. He followed the paper trail. There were what the journalist later called 1,000 claimants, a flourish more rhetorical than literal, but the spectacle began to assemble itself rapidly. An initial press release from the hotel had noted only the presence of money. By the time citizens read about a recluse with hidden fortune, the city had already formed an opinion. Here was a cautionary or heroic tale, depending on one's temperament, about a woman who had made a life out of secrecy. The newspapers lined up along a spectrum between curiosity and moralizing outrage. Some columnists framed the event as a scandal. How dare one hoard while the rest of the country tightened belts? Others, with a softer pen, treated Evelyn as an eccentric relic of a gentler past. Both frames missed what the inventory revealed. That identity, too, can be hoarded. The young lawyer, for his part, kept working. He read the letters, reconstructions, since many envelopes had been burned by someone careful of gaps in a narrative, and annotated each for provenance. One note, reconstructed from fragments and so marked in his ledger, addressed Dear L, and spoke in careful codified sentences about instructions for discreet payments and the management of accounts. Another was a brief memorandum, written on the back of a telegraph form, listing names of banks and the dates on which certain certificates had been purchased. Reconstructed from fragments of correspondence found in Trunk C, the ledger noted, and the narrator's voice softened in those marginalia, not to sentimentalize, but to insist on honesty. The reconstruction was not the same as an original echo. It was a circumscribed attempt to imagine a voice left only in the spaces between official documents. Outside the hotel's walls, the city hummed a familiar, indifferent tune. Soup kitchens continued their work. Makeshift vendors sold gloves in gutters. Unemployed men lingered around labor exchange boards, waiting for their names to be called. The story of the Holloway estate became a lightning rod. People wanted to know not only who would receive the money, but why someone had chosen secrecy over philanthropy. The journalists, trained to convert nuance into a headline that could be scanned over breakfast, argued in editorial columns about ethics and about the American dream, the paradox of a nation that promised reinvention while punishing those who attempted it through artifice. The notion that self-reinvention could be an instrument of both survival and theft is a recurring wound in American social history. Evelyn's life occupied that wound. She had remade herself in a world that allowed, even rewarded, certain kinds of transformation. Yet in doing so, she had disavowed an origin that would, eventually, step forward and demand recognition. The law had a habit of exposing what secrecy sought to freeze. As the young lawyer began to track the paper, he turned to public records. Census sheets from the mill town that listed families by their trade and by the number of mouths they fed. Baptismal entries in parish logs, neat in their ink strokes. Naturalization papers folded with the care of official stamps. Step by step, he built a map of the life hidden beneath the Holloway veneer. There was a baptismal entry in a church ledger, that most humdrum of documents, that recorded a child's name different from the one the parlor photograph suggested. There were passenger lists from a steamship that showed a family arriving with a trunk and 2 small children, their names anglicized at the pier in a clerk's brisk hand. There were census pages that noted occupations, spinners, laborers, peddlers, that did not match the genteel occupations printed in the society pages. These were the small, stubborn truths that could not be sewn into hems. At a small public hearing arranged to determine temporary custody of goods, a draftsman from the hotel's accounting staff testified to the numbers, the bills, the list of jewels, the value of the bonds. He testified in a voice so competent it might have been hiding other feelings. He spoke of cash in rooms and sealed packages, and instructions left in a handwriting that suggested the presence of legal counsel. The hearing itself was a modest ritual, bureaucratic in its cadence, but it signaled the point at which private strangeness became public matter. The story, however, was not yet resolved. The artifacts were catalogued, but not yet explained. The young lawyer's next step, the one that would lead him to the parish registers and the agricultural census, required patience and the permission of the court to subpoena records. That permission, when it arrived, was a small triumph of administrative determination. It authorized the investigator to follow the paper across county lines, to request copies from dusty repositories, and to interview a woman in a mill town who remembered a girl who used to sing while she worked the loom. In that woman's testimony, reconstructed cautiously from a deposition, the investigator found a line that hesitated between affection and reproach. "She always wanted to be someplace else," the witness said. "She learned to stand like a lady when she was not one." It was a sentence that, in its simplicity, captured the moral ambiguity at the heart of the story. Reinvention is a technique and a betrayal in the same breath. It can save a life and sever a family. When the first tranche of records arrived, microfilm images of parish pages, a marriage license in another county, an old boarding house register, the young lawyer sat with them late into the night. He drew lines connecting names and dates, and the places where a child's name had been altered, perhaps intentionally, perhaps as a function of clerks anglicizing names to fit forms. Each connection he made was a tentative step toward unmasking, but it was also a delicate act of interpretation. To say that a woman had lied was not the same as to say she had been criminally deceitful. The law would inevitably draw conclusions about possession and rightful heirs, but the moral questions were larger than what a ledger could resolve. One of the most peculiar items in the inventory was a small, plain packet of paper, perhaps a memorandum, in which she, Evelyn, had apparently stipulated private arrangements for cash payments to a man whose name appeared as a signature in various stock ledgers. The memorandum was unsigned in places and complete in others. It suggested a set of economic understandings that, while informal, functioned with the solidity of an oath in her mind. She had not trusted institutions with all her money. She had instead trusted persons whose names could be written across the balance of a life, and who, for the most part, had been unreliable. The hotel, the city, and the lawyer's ledger were then the converging spaces where private habits met public procedures. The first public hearing ended with the court ordering an official inventory to be taken and a registry to be opened. Notices were placed in newspapers. The exact phraseology of the notice looked bland in print. Persons claiming an interest in the estate of Evelyn Holloway are requested to present themselves. But for those who had been excluded by years of social live theater, it was a summons that felt like permission. Claims arrived in forms expected and unexpected. A cousin from a neighboring state filed a notice. A woman who described herself as a friend of the family swore that she had been promised a bequest in private. A man with a handwriting that suggested hurried sympathy submitted a photograph of a pair of gloves he said had been given in gratitude for nursing during an influenza season. These claimants created a small universe of competing narratives. Each document became a petition not only for money but for recognition. A life that had been held in secrecy now demanded accounting. The young lawyer catalogued the claims with a tempered hand, noting which were supported by affidavits and which were mere appeals. And yet, even as the paper trail thickened, there remained an image of Evelyn that would not dissolve. The photograph in the gilt frame, her self-management of posture and smile, the care with which she had staged her life. The photograph was not a document of truth, but a kind of argument she had made to the world. It testified to the power of performance. The hotel suite remained a room of contradictions. It had been the place where she preserved the objects of a life, and the place where, finally, those objects would be inspected. Staff members, who had swept the corridors and prepared the tea for decades, whispered in the back service area about the unexpected intrusion of account ledgers into a place of ritual. They spoke of the small human gestures they had observed. A woman who once fed pigeons from her window, a habit of mending the hems of a companion's stockings. A single Sunday, years ago, when she opened the shutters to let in more light because the city seemed especially sharp and alive. The life that had chosen seclusion had left a residue of tenderness that complicated the easy moral narratives the city loved. She was not only a hoarder of wealth, but a woman who had, in ways both grand and trivial, tried to be hospitable to a world that did not easily reciprocate. The presence of money in the trunk could not erase the small acts of gentleness found in the margins of a dry accountant's entries. A receipt for a physician called in, an envelope addressed to a charity that had been used only once to make a donation. These details invited pity alongside judgment. By the time the first claimants had filed and the newspaper had printed a second editorial arguing over the ethics of hoarding in a time of scarcity, the young lawyer had compiled a preliminary dossier that suggested a pattern. Names in parish registers matched, with reasonable hypothesis, the name she had been given at birth. A boarding house register placed a young woman with the same initials in the city, where the family's path first intertwined with that of a man whose fortune derived from publishing and politics. The paper trail did not scream a singular truth. It constructed carefully and insistently a narrative that undercut Evelyn Holloway's carefully curated persona, and so the public unspooled what had been private. The image of a woman who had been seen at tea rooms and charity bazaars began to turn, in newsprint, into the figure of a recluse who had spent decades protecting a hoard. Columns made the calculus moral. Did the law, the papers demanded, belong to the person who kept it hidden, or to the kin whose names were listed on parish pages? Would the money be returned to the children of labourers who never expected to see such sums, or would it be absorbed by the machinery of interest and litigation? The questions were, in themselves, a kind of indictment of a nation that proclaims reinvention as a virtue and then treats the tools of reinvention with suspicion when they threaten to undo received categories. Evelyn Holloway had, in the end, wagered on herself. The city, with its courts and its newspapers, was prepared to examine her bet. This is where the story pauses, not because the facts have ended, but because the narrative is only just beginning to bend toward disclosure. The inventory had been catalogued, the initial claims filed, and the first archival records requested. The young lawyer, having pieced together the first scaffolding of a life lived twice, prepared to cross county lines and seaports, to summon parish clerks and boarding-house keepers, and to press into the small white spaces on microfilm where a different name might be hiding. On a cold March afternoon in 1937, with a court order in his pocket and a porter's list of trunks to be held under seal, he stepped back into the hotel parlor. The portrait over the mantel watched him as if it, too, were gauging the velocity of revelation. He opened the prayer book to the page where a small slip of paper lay tucked between psalms. The handwriting was smaller than expected, greedy with loops and abbreviations. Someone had, at some point, scribbled another name in the corner. He read aloud, reconstructing as he went, careful to mark the document's uncertain provenance, and to note on his ledger that whatever he said now must be treated as a hypothesis until corroborated by records held in other towns and other hands. Outside, the city moved on. The newsboy called headlines in the same rhythm as always. A tram rattled past the hotel windows, and across town men and women stood in bread lines that would not yet know how the next season of their lives would change. Inside the room, the stacks of papers waited theirs, that peculiar stillness that precedes the great sifting. The legal wheels were set to turn, and with them the potential for restitution, reckoning, and perhaps the terrible clarity of exposure. The Holloway name, once a curtain of velvet, was about to be drawn aside. The legal wheels began to turn with the particular noise of bureaucracy, soft, inexorable, the kind that grinds through paper rather than muscle. Joseph K. Marsh, the young lawyer whose ledger had first smelled of starch and dust in the Holloway parlor, left the hotel with a court order in his pocket and a list of places that looked, on paper, like a constellation of small, stubborn facts: a parish hall in a mill town, a boarding-house ledger in a port city, a county clerk's vault where pages of the past lay folded in the dark. He traveled by train, his briefcase a heavy, pragmatic companion. Outside the carriage window, the country slid past in economies of green and brown. Occasional factories, their chimneys like fingers, pointed up a history of work that made polite society's parlors possible. Marsh kept his hands folded around a packet of photocopies, microfilm still warm from the copying machine, letters loosely bundled and annotated with pencil notes whose edges had the faint grey of too many fingers. He read them as others read sermons, not for comfort, but for instruction. The first stop was the parish where, according to an entry reconstructed from a microfilm roll, a child's name had been placed in ink opposite the date of baptism. The parish record, when presented in court, would be thin evidence, an eve of handwriting that might be interpreted in multiple ways. But it had weight when matched with other slips. A boarding-house register with the same initials scrawled beside a name, a passenger manifest listing a family who arrived with a chest and the blank raw hope of the newly arrived. Each document on its own could be waved away as coincidence. Together they tightened into an argument. Reconstructed from parish ledger, St. Mark's, county of L. Dace, Marsh wrote in his notes, and the ledger took on a shape the lawyers could file and the judge could read. The parish entry, as reconstructed for the court record, read in the young lawyer's careful phrasing. This, he would later explain under oath, was a reconstruction based on a microfilm copy that showed partial ink fading, gaps in the roll, and a clerk's marginal scribble that suggested an anglicized name. Reconstructed parish entry, extract. Baptism of Anna, daughter of Patrick and Margaret Walsh. Sponsors, Michael O'Leary, Mary Hanlon. He did not say the word lie in his notes. The law does not require moral verdicts. It requires evidence and lineage. In the mill town, a place where the air tasted faintly of cotton lint and the square still remembered the cadence of shift whistles, Marsh walked to a house where an elderly woman brewed tea as if hospitality could be measured in ounces. She had been referenced in a deposition filed earlier, a neighbor who had kept her memory of a family that had once lived above a bakery. Marsh showed her the photograph pulled from the Wellington house, the studio portrait that had sat over the parlor mantel for decades. And the woman's hands, spotted and marked by years of work, tightened. "I remember her," the woman said slowly, each syllable a coal of memory. "She sang at the windows, always wanted a different coat. We used to laugh 'cause she practiced the way a lady held a cup. She wasn't one of us, not really. But she was our little—" Her voice softened, searching for the term. "Our own." That phrase, "she always wanted to be someplace else," would be quoted in the court papers. It was not evidence, strictly speaking, but it provided texture, the human margin that documents sometimes failed to fill. Marsh took notes, copied the woman's oral testimony into a typed affidavit, and stamped it with the bureaucratic meaning that would let the courthouse read memory as fact. Back in the city, the initial hearings were ordinary in their ritual. A clerk called names. Lawyers stood and introduced themselves. A judge with a practiced indifference read from a prepared order, and, like any efficient administrator of estate law, appointed a trust company to take temporary custody of the goods. The trust company placed the trunks under seal and moved the bulk of the jewelry and paper into a vault. For the first time since the hotel manager's hesitant hand had found the folded bills, the wealth interiorized in the Holloway rooms came under a legal roof. The press, predictably, found all of this irresistible. The phrase, "sleeping on $500,000, became shorthand for outrage and fascination. Crowds assembled outside the courthouse in the way congregations assemble at the gate of spectacle, to see the lawyers, to read the notices posted on the clerk's door, to whisper theories that were equal parts envy and moralizing. Among them were people who had known the Holloways when they came down to breakfast at the Wellington house, people who claimed kin, and people who wanted only to be present at the spectacle of a private life made public. One category of claimants proved especially hard to differentiate from opportunists, the sentimental petitioners. A woman, unremarkable in dress but fierce in tone, filed a claim that she had been promised certain monies for the care of a child in the early years of the Holloway's city life. Marsh's ledger marked her entry with a marginal note. Insufficient proof. No contemporaneous receipt. Another man submitted a photograph of a pair of gloves and an affidavit declaring that the gloves had been a token. His handwriting trembled with the kind of earnestness history sometimes misreads as authenticity. There were other claims more legal in tone. A distant cousin whose lineage could be traced with difficulty on the basis of a county census. A registry of births that suggested family connections in the same county the parish had recorded. The trust company took each petition seriously, demanding sworn affidavits where claims looked plausible and dismissing those that did not meet legal thresholds. The process was slow, deliberate, the law moving like a great reluctant tide that eventually carries even the most stubborn flotsam. Marsh's task was both to assemble the provenance of goods and to make a case for rightful heirs. He worked with an archivist from the Historical Society who had the patient delight of people who have spent decades reading faded ink. Together they cross-referenced names, filled gaps in the microfilm, and cautiously began to sketch a family tree that looked less like a fiction invented for parlor approval and more like the messy kinship of immigrants who had anglicized names at ports and changed addresses across counties. Alongside the legal machinery, other actors entered the stage. Appraisers who whispered about the authenticity of a brooch, clerks who decoded a faded company seal on a bearer bond, and a specialist in currency who could tell, by the worn fibers and the ink stamp, the decade in which a particular note had circulated. These experts testified at hearings in voices that tried to remain neutral. Their testimony served to translate material into money into legal value. Reconstructed from a hearing transcript, Surrogate's Court, 1937. Clerk. State the nature of Exhibit B. Expert. Witness. This is a bearer bond, issued in the name of the Atlantic Manufacturing Company. The certificate, by its plate engraving and the watermark, is consistent with issues from the late 1910s to the mid-1920s. Judge. Noted for the record. The technicalities of valuation, while important to the distribution of estate, were a distraction from the deeper question in the public imagination. To whom did Evelyn Holloway truly belong, if such a mapping were even possible? The legal answer would be precise. Its moral echo would be ambiguous. A turning point came when Marsh received a packet from a clerk in a neighboring county, an envelope that contained a boarding house register, its pages browned and fragile, listing the names of transient families who had come through a port city 2 decades earlier. A name in the register matched, in initials and a handwriting peculiar in its loops, a name Marsh had seen in the parish. It was another small piece that connected the performance in the parlor to an origin of carpentry and coal dust. Reconstructed boarding house register extract, photocopy. Walsh family, P. Walsh, Margaret Walsh, Anna, Mary, room 12, arrival 18. Marsh taped the photocopy to his ledger and drew a line with a pencil. He had begun to make an argument that was less about scandal than about lineage. The Holloway identity had been a shield and a lens, camouflaging a family whose origins placed them squarely in the work of making the city run.
Not everyone who stood at the clerk's gate demanded legal recognition. Some petitioners sought, instead, the narrative recognition of kinship. A woman who ran a small boarding house in a nearby town wrote a letter that Marr included in his dossier. It read, in reconstructed form, of a memory of 2 girls who had once sat at a window sewing by the heat of a stove and teaching themselves the enunciations of a different world.
Such letters had no direct legal effect, but they were the kind of human tissue the court sometimes looked upon with a softening eye. At a later hearing, one of the Holloway's old acquaintances, an organizer of charity luncheons who had known Evelyn by sight, took the stand. She described the way Evelyn had moved in certain circles and the air of cultivated mystery she always wore. The advocate for the rival claimants leaned forward and asked a pointed question. "Did you ever inquire into her past?" The witness's answer was a small rebuke to the culture of polite society. "Why would we?" she asked. That wasn't the point. She held the line between being seen and being left alone. If she had told us, we would have admired her cunning, but we did not think to pry. That evening, Marsh sat alone at his desk, the city's lights shimmering beyond his window, like small, unreliable stars. He thought about the cost of reinvention, the psychic excision that allowed a woman to move among value and refuse recognition of origin. He thought about the people who would, if the law allowed it, find their lives marginally improved by wealth that had been hoarded for decades. He also thought about how the law, in remapping objects to heirs, could not restore the time and familiarity stolen by otherwise quiet disappearances. The final evidentiary push came from an unlikely source, a trunk of letters that had not been properly burned. In a desk drawer wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a frayed ribbon, Marsh found dispatches, some originals, some fragments, between Evelyn and the man who had once been her patron, Charles Wortham, by the parlor's gossip. These notes were not explicit contracts. They were correspondences that moved between intimacy and instruction, between gratitude and ledger. One letter, reconstructed for inclusion in court, contained an instruction about a bearer bond and the dates on which it should be converted to cash in the event of scandal. Reconstructed correspondence from Trunk A. Dear C, I have placed the certificate in the valise labeled Travels. Should the bank demand its sight, you know what to say. Keep the note until our arrangement is clear. E. The tone of the letters did not absolve her. It only made her human. A participant in a set of understandings that mixed emotion, necessity, and the harsh arithmetic of a woman trying to secure her survival and access. It was evidence of strategy rather than criminality. When all the papers were collected, Marsh prepared for the final hearing, a proceeding that, by conventional measure, was small, a surrogate's court session that would determine lawful heirs and the distribution of assets. Yet the case had become a magnet for social commentary. Newspapers promised a judgment not only on the law, but on the meaning of self-reinvention in a country that both celebrated and punished it. The courtroom was austere. The judge, a man whose eyes had been trained on the motions of estates for decades, listened without show. Counsel for claimants argued with practiced restraint about the connections in parish returns and census pages. Counsel for the trustee pointed to the presence of private memoranda that seemed to indicate a long-term arrangement between Evelyn and parties who were, by now, deceased or dispersed. In the gallery sat representatives of the mill town, a neighbor who had known a child named Anna, a cousin whose ledger documented a shared birth certificate, a woman who had asserted familial ties by dint of memory alone. The public leaned forward. The argument, in its legal core, was straightforward. Did the materials in the Holloway estate indicate that Evelyn had the right to dispose of assets as she wished? Or did they show that the person known publicly as Evelyn Holloway was legally another person, with a set of heirs defined by birth? Reconstructed Court Transcript, Surrogates Court, 1937. Judge: Counsel for the petitioners, how do you establish the connection between the deceased and the petitioners? Counsel: Marsh: Your Honor, we submit as Exhibit 12 a set of corroborating records, parish baptismal entries indicating the birth name, a boarding house register placing the family in the relevant port city during the period in question, and a set of correspondence referencing the name Walsh in contexts that align with the other records. Taken together, these demonstrate preponderance of evidence favoring the petitioner's claim. Opposing counsel: We do not dispute the presence of some records, Your Honor, but we maintain that the testatrix enjoyed a right to live under an assumed name. There is no evidence that she intended to defraud any claimant of which she had knowledge at the time of her death. The judge's hands folded. The law recognizes both testamentary freedom and the rights of heirs. It will examine the weight of documentary evidence. When the judgment came, it did not explode. Courts rarely deliver theatrical fireworks. It moved with the careful arithmetic of judges who prefer ciphers to spectacle. The decision, distilled, found that the preponderance of documents supported the petitioner's status as lawful heirs, that Evelyn Holloway had been born under another name, and that, while the choice to assume a different identity was not in itself criminal, it affected the determination of rightful succession in the absence of a clear, valid modern will naming specific beneficiaries. The judge's final order appointed the trust company to oversee the distribution of the estate to those claimants who could meet the legal standards for kinship. It required the trustee to provide an accounting and to make payments, proportioned by statute, to recognized heirs after settling the costs of administration. The reaction outside the courthouse was a performance of what the press had predicted. Columnists wrote of restitution and poetic justice. Editorialists debated whether money deserved the sentimental valence assigned to it by people who had never held a small paycheck and feared its erosion. For a week, the city argued about identity, with people asking whether a life built on performance was therefore a theft. The answers were various and unsatisfying. The distribution was not cinematic. There were paperwork delays and appeals. Some claimants could not prove lineage with the rigor the law demanded. Others accepted modest sums in lieu of protracted litigation. In the end, the greater share of the estate was transferred to individuals who had documented ties, however distant, to what the court had determined to be the deceased's birth family. The money returned in fragments to the social circuits that had never expected it: cousins who ran small groceries, a niece who used her portion to open a millinery shop, a fund established for the education of children of workers in the mill town. The sums for many were transformative. For others they were a bureaucratic irritant in lives that had not paused for public drama. Evelyn's own end was quiet. She died without a public display. Her death certificate listed the surname she had legally assumed for decades. In the Wellington house, the portrait over the mantel remained, an image now at odds with the legal mapping of her life. At the funeral, held in the hotel's modest parlor, a handful of staff attended, and 2 clergy. The body was buried beneath a marker that bore the name Evelyn Holloway in neat letters, the name she had chosen and performed, the name that had bought her access and, ultimately, bought her anonymity. The gravesite, with its nameplate intact, became the last surrender to her chosen identity. Those who received the money did not, for the most part, demand erasure of the name on the stone. They took the funds and, in doing so, extended the irony. The wealth that had been hoarded in a room beneath a photograph of a woman in pearls now bolstered the lives of those whose family had once labored in another world. The narrative that came out of the surrogate's court and the subsequent distributions was never a single moral. It was a knot of human decisions, a woman who chose to reinvent herself not entirely for vanity but for access, a man whose proximity to power enabled practices of concealment, a legal system that sought to assign objects to rightful owners without repairing the relational fractures that had made the concealment necessary, and descendants who received, with varying degrees of ambivalence, sums that altered their lives. In the months and years after the Holloway estate closed, the city continued its rhythms. The Wellington house kept its keys on a ring. New residents took the rooms once occupied by long-term tenants. The portrait over the parlor mantel was moved at first, and then returned. The story found its way into history columns and later into pamphlets about the eccentricities of wealth. It lingered as a cautionary tale and as a small stubborn emblem of the ways in which the American promise of reinvention can become, for some, a grim transaction. We might read that transaction in several directions. One is to admire the audacity of self-invention. How someone from a mill town could, without legal claim to pedigree, learn the grammar of society and recast herself into its margins. But admiration is incomplete without grief. Reinvention often required erasure. The Holloway fiction was built on the absence of recognition for the family she had left. The people who claimed the estate sought not only money but acknowledgement that their histories mattered. Another reading is more critical. The story reveals a social architecture in which those with access to power can conceal assets in ways that other people of lesser means cannot. The bearer bonds, the gold certificates, the folded cash sewn into garments, these were not merely eccentricities. They were instruments of privacy available to a certain class. The fact that a portion of the estate returned to people who had once been poor does not erase the asymmetry of access that made concealment possible. There is also the quiet human cost. The companion who had died before Evelyn had known life in a small room, the staff who tended tea and the small rituals of the hotel's world, the woman in the mill town who remembered a child lifting her chin toward an imagined stage. All these figures hold pieces of a life that, when exposed, made the contours of loneliness more visible. The wealth had bought privacy. It could not buy belonging. The final image that seems to hold the story is simple and stubborn. A hotel room with its curtains tied back, a portrait above a mantel, a grave with a name that protected a choice. The money itself, once dispersed, moved through channels of commerce and need. Checks were written, taxes paid, a small grant established, the tangible traces of the hoard dissolved into the city's economic circulations. The larger, less material traces, how families rearranged their sense of who they were, how a town could feel seen, were no less consequential. If there is a lesson in the Holloway affair, it is not a tidy moral. It is an unsettling question about the American promise, that a person can remake herself, and, in doing so, either claim freedom or inflict a kind of erasure. For some, reinvention is liberation. For others, it is a kind of theft of the narrative by which families understand themselves. The Holloway name remained engraved in neat letters on stone. The Walsh kin, those to whom the court, in its slow arithmetic, had made partial restitution, used their portions in ways both modest and ambitious. One niece opened a shop that sold hats to women who might once have adopted, for a season, a different name. A small educational trust helped a few children through school. The money did what money does. It shifted daily lives in ways that were practical and unromantic. Months later, Marsh filed his final accounting with the court. The trust company reported the distribution and the residual costs of administration. The docket closed, as all dockets must, with a bland notation that belied the human stories in its margins. For Marsh personally, the case followed him as a professional accent, a demonstration of meticulous work and the moral complexities that come with undoing long-standing performances. He kept a copy of the portrait, clipped from a paper, and tacked it inside the ledger he used for other matters. He would show it, years later, to young law clerks as an example of how documents, memory, and human choices conspire. And there the story stops organizing neatly. It becomes instead a small constellation of impressions, a woman who wore two names, a hoard sewn into hems, a court that returned property to people who had been displaced by the social dynamics of an earlier life. The spectacle of discovery made for a good headline, but the legal and human aftermath was more patient and more complicated than newsprint can hold. In the end, perhaps the most piercing image is the one that returns to the hotel's parlor. The portrait above the mantel, its painted composure, watching a room where the truth finally, stubbornly, spilled. The portrait held its position, as if to remind viewers that identity can be as durable in paint as in passport, that a name can be claimed, lived, and worn, even when the paper trail calls it into question. This narrative, this dramatized adaptation anchored on the Holloway family in 1937, is inspired by historical patterns of identity reinvention and hidden estates. It seeks neither to condemn wholly nor to excuse entirely. It records an investigation's meticulous labor, the slow arithmetic of law, and the human consequences that do not reduce neatly to sums. If the story leaves a bitterness as its aftertaste, it is the bitterness of a society that offers reinvention without always providing the nets of belonging. It is the recognition that a life bought by the expense of erasure can end in a kind of solitary victory. If this story resonates, consider exploring the sources that inspired the reconstruction. There are archives, parish registers, and court dockets that reflect the artifacts of similar cases. Reading those materials offers a fuller understanding of how private choices become public matters. And if you found this investigation compelling, subscribe for more explorations of forgotten estates, social reinventions, and the odd, often melancholic intersections where legality and identity meet.